So we're now recording. We are live. I'm going to put this onto YouTube after the fact, probably in a couple of days after this class, but it will show up on YouTube. And I think we can get started. We had kind of run out of time last week, and so we didn't really get to talk about early Islam. And so I've given us sort of the opportunity to think about how we want to deal with that. And this consensus seemed to sort of be, let's spend a little bit of time at the beginning of class, just sort of addressing any questions or statements, anything we want to talk about with early Islam and go from there. There we go. So these slides should be available from the handout from last week. I'm happy to talk about things from the first couple of centuries of Islam, and then we'll shift to sort of the, so last week we looked at two successor states, the Eastern Empire and then early Islam, and today we'll sort of move to the barbarian West, or the Latin West, as a series of successor states. So early Islam, what do we want to say? What are the questions? Huge. What do you mean by that?
It seems that I wonder if Muhammad would be as pleased with it today as he was. I mean, when you look at it, if I understand what I read through a little bit of research,
Yeah.
that Islam and Christianity came from two different sons of Abraham. Is that correct?
Kind of.
Okay, kind of how? What's kind of?
So there's a couple of nuances. You say Islam and Christianity. First of all, while there may be some fact in the family tree somewhere, I'm not ethnically Jewish. I'm Christian, but I'm not biologically a son of Abraham. Right? This bothered my sister's grandfather, Abraham, and then his sons. Now, I don't know if she was mad because she wasn't a son or because she wasn't Jewish. But I'm not literally a son of Abraham. Number one. Number two, the story that is told, right, by Muslims and those outside of Islam is that the Arab world comes from Ishmael. That genealogy is a little bit constructed. We can't really go back and demonstrate that. And so these are the stories that the Arab world or the Muslims told about themselves, but it's a little bit trickier to go back and say definitively this is true or it's just this true. Does that make sense? Kind of the distinction there. So let me maybe do it this way. Before Islam, the Arab world has a lot of different religious opportunities. There's a lot of polytheism. The Arab world is broken up into tribes, and each tribe would tend to have their own sort of patron deity. But there are also Abrahamic influences as well, including Judaism and Christianity. And as Muhammad sort of develops this new faith of Islam, right? He wants to set himself apart from, number one, the sort of polytheism of the Arab tribes. So there is but one God, and that God is Allah. Right? So this is not the polytheism of the Arab tribes. And the closest sort of analog to monotheism then is that Abrahamic. And so one of the ways that Muhammad at first wanted to try to give himself and his new religion some sort of legitimacy and authority is to say, well, this is Abrahamic faith, not unlike some of these other versions that you may have known. That at first works, right? Because that gives an in for maybe people looking for an alternative to polytheism. But then, as the new faith becomes more popular, people begin to think, oh, he's just another Christian. This is just another version of Christianity because it's an Abrahamic faith. So then Muhammad has to say, well, we're not the polytheism religion of the Arabic tribes, but neither are we Jewish or Christian. So there's all kinds of, and in the beginnings of, let me just say, with any kind of religious topic, there can be all kinds of controversies about this. And depending on, I was talking to Chuck about this after classes, he was asking about doing the reporting for this, right? There's a whole spectrum of scholarship on this. There are some people who are going to be anti-Islam and want to sort of criticize it very harshly. There are other people who are going to want to defend it very zealous, depending on their sort of background. All that. Getting at some sort of objective middle ground, then is a little bit tricky, but you know, and in that sort of middle ground, scholars over the last couple of generations have been talking about the sort of stories that early Muslims told to sort of legitimize this. So that idea of tracing their lineage back to Ishmael is part of that storytelling that they use. These are our origins. This is where we came from. This is. Well, I don't know if Cindy that.
Well, then what you're saying basically is that when you read, Muhammad had a vision, right?
Right.
Okay, so he had this vision and he used it and he was like, oh, well, this comes, Ishmael from Abraham,
Right.
influences.
Right.
So he's just kind of like, in a way, playing a new child a bit on this topic, part of it.
And
Might be reading that one.
I mean, it depends on.
I mean,
Again,
is
there are
there
different
any
ways to do that.
documentation that he is, or there is this connection between Ishmael and Muhammad?
Well, we don't know. We know that they begin telling these stories, but does that tradition predate Muhammad, right? Or is he making the story up? Again, the scholars making the story up. So, what I tried to say at the beginning is we don't have the evidence to say for sure what.
Okay.
So it might be, but to say that conclusively.
So it's more like legend says.
Yeah. Other than the vision is the story of how this religion begins. And again, there's all kinds of spectrum of how credible is this, right? Is he just a charlatan? Is he making these things up? Did he really have a vision? Is there some middle ground? Let me sort of get at the way to answer these kinds of questions by giving a sort of analog story, right? That has to do with medieval Christianity, not Islam, but from the sort of Christian perspective. And when I was in graduate school, we were at a conference and there's a big fancy dinner and so we grad students were at one end of the table and there are all these kind of highfalutin, renowned, prestigious scholars who were sitting with us. And they were very gracious and generous, but they were deigning to engage the grad students. Oh, what are you studying? What are you interested in? Going around the table. And one of my friends, her research was on early medieval saints and the sort of stories that are told about them and miracles that they did. And by the way, this person herself, my friend, is not a believer. but she was interested. And one of the prestigious scholars said, was sort of not giving her a hard time, but pushing her a little bit on these things. Also coming from, sort of a critical or skeptical background. Saying, you think these, kind of supernatural or miraculous things going to happen. And I think my friend gave a really good answer. It gets at these kind of questions, and she said, it doesn't really matter what I think, but it's what the people at the time thought. Did the things really happen or not? I don't know. But the people at the time believed. And that changed the world, right? That had impacts in everyday life about the way that they engaged with each other and religiously, and the actions that they made and the decisions that they made. And maybe they're legends, maybe they're myths, maybe they're just stories, we don't know. Maybe Muhammad made up the whole vision thing or not, I don't know. Or maybe not, but he believed he saw something. And then the people who followed him believed he saw something. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but at the time, at least some people did. So the vision is part of it. This is the slide I meant to show. Right here, hires from the there's a why the religion gets started is again, it's controversial, it's a tricky thing. There are different views on this, but there are a few important things I think that we need to at least consider. Right. So on the one hand, you could say he has this religious experience, or he says he has this religious experience. There's sort of religious. The religious aspect. I keep changing slides because in my head, let me just apologize. My brain is not at 100% today. My Latin class is a mess. So I'm trying to say on top of things, but my brain is not at full speed. It's working at maybe 85%. Another sort of aspect of Muhammad's experience puts him in, when I give this full lecture, I try to situate the pre-Islamic Arab world and early Islam in this larger kind of late Roman or post-Roman world. And one of the things that we've talked about already in the first few weeks that we've been together is this idea of asceticism and the ability, remember monasticism, remember asceticism, this idea that you renounce all the sort of temptations of this world, higher from engagement with the world. Often you'll go out in the wilderness and you'll try to live a sort of spiritual life. And people who do this, when we talk about monasticism, we talk about all of the sorts of interactions between monks and the larger world, right? They have a sort of social clout, they have a sort of political clout, they have a sort of cultural clout. And one way to talk about these people who do this is as a holy man, or it could be a holy woman. But this sort of holy man figure, a sort of recluse, someone who has given up their claims to this world, has a sort of special place in society because they have a sort of special access to the world beyond this world that the rest of us were bogged down in daily life and all the concerns of daily life. Margie gave me a couple of parenting magazines. A good holy person doesn't have to worry about the concerns of this. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians, right? It's good to marry, but if you can devote your life to Christ and not worry about all of the domestic affairs of family life, that's good too, right? So the holy man is not, or holy woman is not bogged down with the concerns of this life. They can devote all of their time to spiritual endeavors. And so Muhammad is part of this larger, what we might say, late antique movement to get away from the world and to pursue religious, spiritual sort of endeavors. So that's part of the religious aspect of this. It's not just that he's kind of wacky, fringy, hanging out in a cave just to hang out in a cave, but he's part of a larger. Notice he has the ability to do this, right? He has the sort of security and financial means to do this because he marries a more prosperous woman. Muhammad himself was a merchant. He's born into a merchant family. They're doing okay for themselves, but nothing especially special. Khadija comes from a more wealthy family with better social connections, with better political connections, with more financial income, and with all of her resources after they get married. Muhammad says, okay, I don't have to do this merchant thing. I can go out and pursue that sort of ascetic lifestyle. Let me say one other thing, quick thing here about Khadija, and then I'll pause for questions. But you'll notice this is not a typo, or at least perhaps originally it was, and I have left it that way on purpose. You'll notice there are two different spellings of her name. And as Cindy has done some reading, I don't know, some of the rest of us may have as well, you'll see both of these. And the reason for this is, right, that this comes from Arabic. Arabic does not use a Latin alphabet, right? So it's transliterated from Arabic into a Latin alphabet, and there's a certain phonetic movement to that, right, where you ascribe letters according to the sounds that they would make in Arabic. Well, I mean, this sort of sounds the same either way, Khadija or Khadija, right? It's sort of the same sounds, just spelled a little bit because it's phonetic transliteration. Neither is wrong, both are right. I left that on there as sort of representation. One of the problems with doing work like this that's transliterated, you'll see different spellings talking about the same person. All right. Time out, pause. Questions, comments, concerns? Patty, she's robbing the crib. I mean, he's not super young, he's not a child, literally, but he is marrying. He's older than him, more established than him. He has resources. She could, right? Because it's through her resources. Well, but he's not doing the business either. He's using her family. They are using her family connections. He's not doing the trading anymore. This is what allows him to go out in the wilderness and have this vision, because he doesn't need to be the trader. Right now they have these other caravans doing the merchant business for them. Does that kind of make sense? Other questions? Yep.
That same mission I've put before.
Yep.
Our Lady of Fatima, which is in Portugal.
Yep.
Portugal.
So yes, later. But Islam will expand very quickly. We can talk about this maybe as we get there, but you'll see that Islam will spread from basically the generation of Muhammad by the end of the 700s through North Africa and Persia, and then early into the 700s across North Africa and most of Iberia, which is this is not. Yes, sir.
It's that seems to me like the map. Spending quite quickly. Is there a reason for it?
Yes, there are reasons for it. It does spread remarkably. It does. Now, let me first do the tricky part. There is a tricky part to this question, and then there's an easier. The tricky part is, in a number of ways, a lot of this early expansion does happen militarily. And there is a tension to characterize Islam as a violent religion. And we have to, on the face of it, say, yes, to an extent. A lot of this is military. There is a military aspect to that. And you can't just on the one hand. On the other, a lot of times when that is talked about, Islam as a violent religion, this idea is brought up. The idea of jihad. So a holy war or a holy struggle. Now here's the trick. In a lot of our early sources, that idea of jihad is talked about not necessarily in this sort of sense of a physical military holy war, but more of an internal spiritual holy struggle against sin as a personal. So, is there violence here? Is there military expansion? Yes. Is Islam kind of intrinsically a violent religion? It's hard to say. Okay. So I want to kind of get that out of the way. The other, let's see. Go ahead.
Isn't the Islamic response Christianity is not spread by the civil? Similar histories.
So
Inquisition.
the quick answer to that, we can spend a whole semester talking about religious things. The quick answer to that is sometimes in any sort of, right, we're all human, we're all fallen, in any sort of human expression, religious or otherwise, there are going to be darker parts of this, maybe parts of an institution's history that are not so good. So yes, it does happen kind of. But again, that is a larger conversation. That is very interesting and something that could be investigated. So while I try to come back to that, other comments. Who was it that had originally? Mike, was it you that had asked about the quick expansion? Yeah. One of the other things that makes this happen, that allows this to happen very quickly, is you might remember last week we talked about the Byzantines up here. And we talked about Justinian's conquest and how he comes down here in North Africa and becomes part of North Africa for the Roman Empire, parts of Spain and Italy, and it expands the Eastern Empire significantly. However, he sort of overreaches the military strength through some of those campaigns. Some of those campaigns, especially in Italy, are harder than they expect. There are other problems like famine and plague. You've got the Persian Empire over here, who through that whole period is also fighting against the Byzantines. And that conflict goes through the 500s and 600s. So we have 100 years of warfare between the Byzantines and the Persians. And right around that time, right, Muhammad receives his vision in 610 AD. After nearly a century of conflict here, and Muhammad's right down here. All of these people are exhausted. There's been war, there's been famine, there's been plague. All of the young men have died. And all of a sudden, this new religion shows up and they say, hey, we want your land, and there's not much that the Persians or the Byzantines can do. So there's a little bit of a power there. Also, and this is one other thing that I thought of real quickly. Not only is there a power vacuum here, but also, we touched on this a little bit last week. We said that Justinian and Theodora were both Christians, but they had sort of different versions of Christianity. Theodora was a heretic. There are some heresies over here, and especially in the Byzantine world, they do not get a lot of support, and in fact, in some cases, are even persecuted by the Byzantine state. And we've mentioned how Islam is an Abrahamic faith. And when the Muslims show up, they are of a different faith. But some of these heretic Christians who have been persecuted by the state, the Muslims show up and these heretic Christians say, okay, we've been persecuted for a lot. I know you guys are kind of different, but what's our situation be like with you all? And the Muslims adopt an attitude towards practitioners of Abrahamic faith, calling them, has anybody heard this term before? Again, there's different ways of spelling this. Dhimmi or dhimmi? No. This means people of the book. The book, right? The Old Testament, right? Or even in some cases, the Muslims will accept parts of the New Testament. We'll see Jesus as, a prophet. So there is some sort of religious authority to Jesus or to the New Testament. They just don't see Jesus as the Son of God. And other things like the Trinity are problematic for us. But these people are Abrahamic, right? They follow the commandments. They have a similar Mosaic tradition. They are following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, okay, not Isaac, but of Abraham. And this allows some leniency. Now, this is going to be different in different places at different times. The Christians are sometimes in some places more or less tolerated by Muslims. And it's not a free pass, right? There is a sort of extra tax burden. Let's say toleration. It's called toleration plus extra tax. So fine, you want to worship the Christian God, not a big deal. You just have to pay us a little bit more. Now, if your choice as a, I don't want to get into the theology of this, but let's say a Nestorian or a monophysite, these are two big heresies in the East, in the late Roman world, right? If you're a Nestorian or a monophysite, your choice is persecution by the Byzantine state or pay a little bit of extra money, right? It kind of makes sense. And so in some cases, Christian heretics will kind of welcome Muslim conquest through because it's a better option. So you sort of have a power vacuum, and you have some people who are ready for it. So yes, there are a number of reasons why. Other questions? I shouldn't do this because of time, but there are maybe two more things that I kind of feel responsible for at least letting us know about everybody's. Okay. And this first is a little bit more of a shall we say, a cynical view of the beginnings of Islam. Or maybe if not cynical, at least there's a practical aspect. Right? And we mentioned that in pre-Islamic Arabia, you have all of these different rival gods. And one of the most important places in pre-Islamic Arabian society was the Kaaba, which is this square-shaped building in Mecca. And it's a religious site, and it's a pilgrimage site. It is even today in Islam, but it was even before Islam. And all kinds of Arabian peoples worshiping all kinds of different gods would go to the Kaaba as a pilgrimage site to worship whatever their worship was, including in some cases Abrahamic traditions. This is the place. This is the religious place to go in the pre-Islamic era. It also happens that in the pre-Islamic Arab world, Mecca is also the place where you go for economic power. It's one of the premier trading centers in the Arab world. And we talked about how Muhammad and Khadija were merchants, right? This is the large sort of pulse of Arabian economy is through merchant caravans. So there's lots of merchant trade going on, and that merchant trade flows in and out of Mecca. And with money comes political power. So Mecca is not only sort of the religious hub of the Arab world, not only is it the economic hub of the religious world, but it's the political hub. So why does Muhammad start this new faith, and why is it all of a sudden different than other religious alternatives in the pre-Islamic Arab world? Well, as he marries Khadija, and they have their sort of growing merchants, not empire, but power base. They're taking on the elites, the political elites, the economic elites, the religious elites. Well, if we have a really impassioned new religion that can challenge the religious authorities, that can maybe help us in some other areas as well. You can take that argument sort of to the logical extreme and make it sort of Cynthia had asked this Muhammad the Pharaoh, did he actually not believe any of this? Someone really skeptical might go all the way and say this is just a cynical political power, economic power. There are probably problems with that, as with any extreme. But there are a variety of explanatory schemes that we can come up with. But what we want to see here, but then after this, the Kaaba, as I had mentioned, the Kaaba remains an important religious center. It just is transformed from a sort of catch-all, doesn't really matter what you believe, come to the Kaaba and worship your gods. Still a pilgrimage site. But now Muhammad preaches there's one God. So if you're going to come to the Kaaba, you better be worshiping my God. This is something that happens in a lot of different ways, where early Islam will take the sort of roots of the Arab world that had been there before, keep a lot of the same features, but transform them in a sort of Islamic expression. Questions, comments? Yes, Dave. Dave or Dave?
Harvey.
Harvey. You're Dave over here. My goodness. Harvey.
You're good.
Okay,
Kaaba is a building.
yes,
How big?
I'm sorry.
How big is?
Yeah, did I
It's
get?
not real big, it's inside a mosque, right?
Well, it is the mosque.
Oh,
It is the name of the building. Yeah, I've not been there. I mean, this picture gives us a sort of sense of the scale, but it's significant size. You know, more, I'm not,
It's me,
it's what?
it's me,
It's me.
use your hand on it, it's glass, so. It's the center.
Yeah.
Should make that,
Is it actually a meteor or is it just something you created? Flat?
in there. Smart.
Right, it predates
They,
it.
you don't want to worship there, whatever, but he's the one that said, when we get in here, believe.
So is it man-made?
The covering is.
Yeah, my impression, have you been? Well,
There's a covering over it. The group of women start sewing the day after. Saturday used to cut up pieces, you know, so, yes. That's. That's just.
So it doesn't have
The
function.
the king of Saudi Arabia can go inside.
I think the question was, are there, like, can you go inside? Is there a room inside?
There's a whole people, thousands or hundreds of years of touch, it's made it so stiff. You start in a circle. Then you probably go, well, the machine.
So, that is, those are descriptions that I've not heard. In my study in grad school, I did an extended study on early Islamic, and I've not heard those descriptions of the Kaaba before. I'm not questioning the fact that
There was an English explorer in the 1920s. Learned Arabic, got in, said the first nine. I'm sure there've been others since.
yeah. In any case, this is absolutely true that it predates Islam. You said thousands of years, maybe not multiple thousands of years, but certainly more than 1,000 years, right? Islam has been around for 1,400 years. It predates that, so a long time. I was under the impression that it is new. I'll have to look into this a little bit more.
But there's no legend that there's a relic inside.
Yeah, it's a stone. It's a holy site.
How did it become a home? It's just a stone.
So okay. Okay, this gets a little bit tricky. Boy, you guys are into this, like, I was not.
What makes that so special?
Right.
That's
That's right.
It's real.
There are stories associated with some of these special places that they might not have been anything special to begin with, but because of the stories associated with them, they take on a special. And part of the problem with this, and this gets back to not only the origins of the Kaaba, but also sort of some of that pre-Islamic legend, like say the lineage to Ishmael or something like that. Pre-Islamic society has culture. Right? This is maybe a presumption that we have, or a presupposition that there's no real Arab culture before Islam. Well, in fact, there was a culture. It just wasn't written down. It was passed down orally. And so those legends, where does the Kaaba come from? What is the relationship to Abraham? We don't have written sources to tell us that because the first writings that we get only come with Muhammad, who, as a practitioner of the Abrahamic faith, says, "Oh, we should have," and the whole composition of the Quran is a whole other thing. But these, at least the early Muslims, are saying, as an Abrahamic faith, we should have a spiritual tradition, just like the other Abrahamic faiths. And all of a sudden, now you have a literate, a written culture, whereas before it had been an oral culture. It's not to say they don't have a culture. It's just not. That makes the sort of finding the records of what happened before Islam this or this one? We've got all kinds of. UMMA, the UMA. You know it? Well, yes. It's the body of belief. Now. Right. This is what it means now for Islam. Right, or to mean community, right? And like the Kaaba, and like some other things, this predates Mohammedanism. And originally, this referred to the tribe. And the tribe had all of those significances that we had mentioned with Mecca. Right? This is your social group. There's a social community. But often in these merchant caravans, they would create their caravans based around the Ummah, based around the tribe. And so it's a social community, but it's also an economic community. Well, there's power structures within a community. So it's a political community. You have your own patron god or goddess of the tribe. So it's a religious community, right? So all of those things that I was talking about with Mecca will apply to the different tribes as well. And the top of those groupings are called the Ummah, or the tribe. And then within the tribe, would have clans, and then within clans, you would have families, right? And this is the way that you would order your place within the world, right? You fit into your family, and these are extended families. And then your different family units would be grouped together as clans, and then different clans would be grouped together as tribes, and all of that together was the Ummah. Now, before Islam, there are competing tribes within the Arab world. This is part of that conflict with Mecca. Even before Muhammad, there are competing tribes for political power, economic power, all of these things. The tribe that controls Mecca controls sort of lots long distance trade. After Muhammad, not only is there now not multiple gods, but only one God, so now there's not just lots of competing tribes, there's just one tribe. One. So now all of these distinctions that we've been talking about gets under the umbrella, right? My graduate professor who sort of advised me in learning all this stuff, he would describe the sort of model as an umbrella. And the umbrella of Islam then encompasses all of those religious, political, economic, social. Your place in the world is defined by your place within the larger Islam. This is again another pre-Islamic thing that gets transformed, has its roots there, maintains some of the same sort of structures, but looks very different.
Very similar to Christianity.
In what way?
And how they were constructed.
Well, are you thinking of Hebrew tribes? Okay. Again, I'm not Jewish. I'm not part of one of the tribes of Joseph.
I'm not either.
So what tribe do I belong to? I think this gets a little bit tricky. And
People spent years doing genealogy trying to trace back.
I think this gets a little bit tricky. And
But you do see the similarities, right? You see the similarities. I see the similarities.
Um,
Within a
Look.
period of time, less than 100 years ago, they just looked at this one. Right.
and this is something else
Maybe
that,
split, huh?
this is right, and you have splits and schisms in Christianity.
Right.
This is something that I don't want to get into. Well, mostly for time, right? Just because I was planning to spend 5 or 10 minutes on this one, and we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
The Sunni Shia split comes from Muhammad and Khadija Stall and her marriage to Ali. Fundamentally, the Sunni Shia split, and again, I don't want to get too far down this rabbit trail, but essentially, the Sunni Shia split is after Muhammad dies, and actually several generations later. But who is the legitimate successor? Who is it that gets to claim the authority to lead the Islamic community? Is it just the most capable person, or is it someone genealogically from the line of Fatima, related by lineage to the Prophet? And that's where that comes from. Let me say this, Cindy, about the sort of similarity with Christianity, without getting into some of the sort of sociology of tribes and the theology of being grafted in and some of that kind of stuff. I do see the connection in that all of the believers are, at least in theory, connected by a common overarching idea. And this gets back to Al, right? What Al had said when I said, who knows this term? You had defined it as the body of believers. I think now again, I'm not myself Arabic, I'm not myself Muslim. Someone who is more grounded in those traditions might correct me in this. I don't know that they would translate Ummah as a sort of body, right, or the tribal system. However, we do have that language in Christianity where we are all part of one body, right? Paul uses this language in the New Testament, right? You have a hand, you have a foot, you have an arm, and Christ is the head. And so we have our own imagery of what binds us, regardless of your tradition, regardless of if we were to sort of compare and take them as analogies, right? Wherever you were to fit in the family tree, you are part of the body itself. And I do see those similarities, that there is a sort of language, there is a sort of imagery that binds the whole community, regardless of time and place, together as one. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes,
A little bit more?
basically, you only have so many types of structures in society.
Sure.
Okay, so when you set up there and do that, you had family, you had clans, you had tribes, and then you've got all these different families, clans of like all the families of the Methodist Church or the different churches.
Yeah,
Right.
and that's a conversation that I'm trying to avoid.
Well, I know, but you see what I'm saying. I'm just saying in the general structure, I'm not saying specifically.
Right.
I'm saying in the general structure, it's very similar, it's similarities.
Potentially. I think we could nuance exactly what those similarities are.
Right.
Sure. In that we're all supposed to be part of one community. These I think are four football, right? 10 minutes for Islam, and we're going to do all of it for Islam, 10 minutes for religion. But before I close this down, other
Let me ask a question. May bring us back. Is there any other society that has had a dark ages or a back besides Christianity?
this is I'm laughing. You can't tell everybody. My reaction is because I'm laughing. I'm laughing because, first of all, whenever we get back around to Western Europe, I'll say, all right, what do we do with this idea of government? But I'm laughing here because I have had a student in the past who was a Muslim, and I was just having a recent conversation with this individual. Where they said that they see right now the Middle East and Africa as being part of the dark age. This is from a perspective of someone from the therapist. I'm gonna let that individual speak for themselves because I am not from that region. I don't feel like I'm in a place to say, you guys over there are in a dark age. I'm not gonna do that. This individual thought that
Did they define why?
I tried to press a little bit and so yeah, maybe. There is, again, this gets into what do we mean by a dark age? Before all of this that we're doing this semester, long time ago. So we're talking like 1000 BC, even a little bit before that. 1100. Right? This is the end of what's called the Bronze Age. At the end of the Bronze Age, there's a lot of activity, international activity going around over here in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then for a whole number of reasons and factors that I'm not going to get into, that all kind of comes crashing down. And from about, let's say, 1100 or 1050 BC to around 800 BC, or a couple hundred years, we just don't have any written records. Like, nobody is telling us anything about what's going on. Now, again, just like what we said with Arab rule over Islam, this does not mean the culture disappears. This is why dark age can be a tricky thing. It's not that they just became savages running around beating each other over Dutch clubs. They're just passing on their stories, their culture, oral. Right? This is where Homer's poems, the Odyssey and the Iliad, come from an oral tradition over hundreds of years. They were telling each other stories. They were worshiping gods. They were practicing cultural storytelling and myths about where we came from. They're just not writing it down. That's sometimes called a dark age. And that's part of what's going on over here in the barbarian West. And remember from a couple of weeks ago what we said about barbarians. They're not necessarily savages, although if you read the Clovis reading, some of them can be quite savage. They're not necessarily uncivilized, they're just not writing things down. It's a pre-literate oral culture instead of a textual written. And so that gets a little bit tricky at what we mean by her. But yes, there have been forms. That's a long answer to say yes in different contexts. Other responses or questions? Anything that you want to say from those readings, either about Clovis or about the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons?
It's next week, right?
Yeah,
Like,
Yeah.
next week.
yeah, we've got just 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll be a week behind. We'll figure
Yeah, the accuracy of dates on this kind of stuff, they're good, right? Compared to-
yes.
so it's not like-
It's fine. Partly because we have collaborating sources, right? Islam is spreading so quickly, we have the Byzantine saying, we have Arabs that are pretty big. Not literally, right? But it is a little bit. The Persians are telling us. Now, I don't read Persian, so I'm not reading the sources. We have corroborating evidence, collaborating evidence to match the song. But as I've suggested a number of different ways, the motivations for how and why some of these things happen are often Here's a little bit of, oh, go ahead, Harvey. Nope, this is the bit of trivia that I was going to give. So good anticipation. Do I have it? I do. So part of Muhammad's story that we didn't talk about is that as his new faith is growing and he's accumulating converts, as you could guess, right? He's doing this in Mecca, and it does not make the Meccan elites happy. So he has to get out of that. And he goes to another city called Medina, and it's this called the Hijra, meaning flight, that starts the Muslim path. This is, oh, I don't have it in front of me. I think it's 620, 622 AD. I could be fact-checked on that, but it's right around 622. Does anybody know how the Muslim calendar works? This is their year zero. We're starting from the fall. It's exiled from Mecca and has to-
622 is considered not year zero.
And at first, it's not too much of a problem to match it up for our year one for them is pretty much year one for us. Al, you're sort of saying, yeah.
It's lunar.
Yep.
Not solar.
Yes.
The months are all the same, 30. So therefore, their holidays and all will
Sure.
period. But I think it's 33 years. You will have one in the summer.
Yep.
Will be in the winter.
Yep.
Years later. Yeah.
Yep.
Unlike the Jewish.
It's not a solar. So the length of the year is different. And so the farther you go along, there are more years in the Muslim calendar, more years have passed in the Muslim calendar than in the past ones. To that point, oh man, why am I blanking? Ramadan. When I was in graduate school some 15 years ago, Ramadan was in the fall, and now it's in the late spring, summer.
So what year is it?
And it's been a long time since.
1782. Still there.
Okay. Okay. Hey Siri, what year is it in the Muslim calendar?
I found this on the web. For what year is it in the Muslim calendar? Check it out.
1442, according to one. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Sears.
I think we're just about out of time.
So this has been very interesting.
Good. I'm glad. Well, and that's what this is about, is to engage with you guys in questions. So, we'll shuffle the schedule around a little bit. We'll do what we can through the rest of the time together. Great. I'm glad to engage with everyone. And I will post this video in the next couple of days to YouTube and send out an email to it as well. If you have questions. All right. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week. All right.